The burlap sack concealed a face Tova thought he'd never see again, a woman the entire territory believed had perished in flames 3 years prior. And the moment he recognized her, he knew that saving her life might cost him everything he'd fought to protect. The dust devil rose from the canyon floor like a spirit seeking vengeance. Tova reined his paint horse to a standstill, eyes narrowing against the harsh September glare that beat down on the Llano Estacado. The year was 1867, and the Texas plains stretched endless in every direction, a sea of brown grass and red earth, broken only by scattered mesquite and the occasional jutting rock formation. Heat shimmered off the ground in waves, distorting distance, making the horizon dance and blur. Something moved near the canyon rim, 100 yards ahead. Not an animal. The shape was wrong, too angular, too deliberate. Tova's hand drifted to the rifle across his saddle, fingers finding the worn wood of the stock without conscious thought. 3 years as a scout for the frontier settlements had taught him that anything unexpected in this territory meant danger. He approached slowly, reading the ground as he moved. No tracks except his own, which meant whoever or whatever lay ahead had been there since before dawn, when the wind had scrubbed the earth clean. The sun was past its zenith now, the temperature climbing toward what the white settlers called unbearable. Tova barely noticed. He'd been born in this heat 28 years ago, raised by a Comanche mother and Mexican father, knew its rhythms like his own heartbeat. The shape resolved itself as he drew closer. A person collapsed on their side near the canyon's edge, wrapped in what looked like a burlap sack tied at the neck. The fabric was stained dark with sweat and dust, and whoever lay beneath it hadn't moved since Tova first spotted them. Dead, probably. The canyon rim was no place for the unprepared, and this person had clearly been unprepared for everything. Tova dismounted 20 feet away, keeping his rifle ready. Bandits sometimes used decoys. Wounded travelers left as bait while gunmen waited in the rocks. His eyes swept the surrounding terrain. The canyon dropped away 50 yards to his left, its walls red sandstone carved by ancient water. To his right, the plains rolled on unbroken. Behind him, his own tracks stretched back toward the distant smudge that was Fort Griffin. Ahead, nothing but the figure in the sack and the merciless sun. He knelt beside the body, noting the shallow rise and fall of breath beneath the burlap. Still alive then, but not for long. The sun had been working on this person for hours, maybe since dawn. Dehydration would finish what exposure had started. Tova reached for the cord binding the sack at the neck, his fingers touching rough hemp rope tied in a complex knot. Not the kind a person tied on themselves. This was the work of someone else, someone who knew how to secure a prisoner. The moment his fingers touched the knot, the figure jerked weakly. A hand emerged from beneath the sack, fingers splayed in what might have been defense or plea. The skin was burned red from sun, blistered in places, and the hand trembled with exhaustion. The nails were broken and torn, with dirt packed beneath them. "Easy," Tova said in English, his voice low and steady. He repeated it in Comanche, then in Spanish. "I'm not here to hurt you. Stay still." The hand dropped back beneath the sack. The fight had gone out of whoever this was. Tova worked the knot loose, noting how expertly it had been tied. A vaquero's knot, the kind used for securing loads on pack animals. Someone with experience had bound this prisoner. He pulled the sack away carefully, prepared for anything. What he found made him rock back on his heels, breath catching in his chest. The face beneath the burlap was burned and cracked from exposure, lips split and bleeding, eyes swollen nearly shut. But he knew those features. He'd seen them countless times 3 years ago when he'd worked as a scout for the Bowen Ranch. Teresa Bowen. Tess, as she'd insisted everyone call her. Daniel Bowen's wife. The educated woman from Philadelphia who'd come west to teach school and ended up marrying the territory's most promising young lawyer. The woman who died 3 years ago when the Bowen Ranch house burned to the ground during a Comanchero raid. Except she hadn't died. She was here now, barely alive on the canyon rim, 50 miles from where her grave marker stood in the Fort Griffin cemetery. Tova's mind raced through possibilities, each one more impossible than the last. The entire territory had mourned her. Daniel had nearly lost his mind with grief, or what everyone had interpreted as grief. The circuit preacher had delivered a sermon about the tragedy of innocence lost to frontier violence. Tess's eyes fluttered open, and despite the swelling, despite the damage, he saw recognition dawn in them. Her cracked lips moved, forming words without sound at first. Tova leaned closer. "Don't," she whispered, voice like sand scraping stone. "Don't tell." "Please?" Then she was gone, unconscious again. Tova sat frozen for a moment, caught between shock and the pressing need for action. Questions could wait. Right now, this woman needed water, shade, and care, or she'd die for real this time. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was. Not just thin, but wasted, like she'd been surviving on scraps for weeks. The dress beneath the sack was tattered, held together more by dirt than thread. Her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been something else. No shoes, no supplies. Nothing but the sack and the clothing falling apart on her body. Tova carried her to his horse and somehow managed to mount while holding her across his saddle. The paint snorted nervously at the extra weight and the smell of sickness, but settled under Tova's hand. He turned the horse east, away from Fort Griffin, away from the settlements where Daniel Bowen still lived and worked as the territorial judge. Instinct told him to keep her hidden until he understood what was happening. His camp was 3 miles distant, tucked into a draw where a spring fed a small pool year-round. He'd been using it as a base for the past week while tracking cattle thieves through the canyon country. The camp was simple, just a lean-to shelter and a fire ring, but it had water and shade and privacy. The ride took half an hour, Tova moving carefully to avoid jostling his unconscious passenger. His mind worked the entire time. Tess Bowen had died in 1864 in April. He'd heard the story from a dozen sources. The Bowen ranch had been attacked at dawn by Comancheros. They'd set fire to the ranch house after ransacking it. Daniel had been away in Austin on territorial business. When he returned 3 days later, he'd found ashes and bones. The bones had been buried with full honors. Tova had attended the funeral, standing at the back with the other scouts and ranch hands. He'd watched Daniel stand at the graveside, face like carved stone. The man had looked hollowed out, emptied of everything except grief. But if those bones hadn't been Tess, whose had they been? And where had Tess been for 3 years? And who had tied her in a sack and left her to die? The camp appeared ahead. Tova dismounted carefully and carried Tess to the shelter, laying her on his bedroll. He fetched water from the spring, clean and cold from deep limestone, and began the slow work of rehydration. Small sips first, just enough to wet her mouth and throat. Too much too fast would make her sick. Her eyes opened again as he tipped water past her lips. This time there was more awareness in them. She swallowed reflexively, then coughed, then swallowed again. Tova waited while her body remembered how to drink. "Slowly," he said. "Your stomach needs time." She nodded weakly. After a few more careful sips, he set the canteen aside and began examining her for injuries. Her hands and feet were worst, burned and blistered from walking barefoot over hot ground. Her arms showed bruises in the pattern of finger marks. Someone had grabbed her, held her roughly. The marks were old, fading to yellow-green, which meant they'd happened days ago. Tova fetched his medicine kit. Salve made from bear grease and healing herbs, clean cloth for bandages, whiskey for disinfecting wounds. He worked quietly, treating what he could treat. When he finished, he sat back and met her gaze directly. "You want to tell me how a dead woman ends up alive on the Llano Estacado?" he asked. Tess's jaw worked before words came. "How long since you were left there, I don't know. Since I found you about 2 hours." She closed her eyes. "Thought it was over. Thought I'd finally be done." Done with what? But she'd slipped away again, consciousness flickering. Tova let her rest. He built up the fire, though the day was hot because nights on the plains turned cold fast. He made thin soup from jerked beef and wild onions, something her stomach could handle. While it simmered, he tended his horse and checked the surrounding area for signs of pursuit. Nothing. The sun crawled toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Tova fed Tess spoonfuls of soup, most of which she managed to keep down. Color was returning to her face, though she still looked like a woman who'd been through a war. As twilight deepened into night, she finally spoke with strength in her voice. "You're Tova," she said. "You worked for Daniel before I died. You scouted for the ranch." "I did. I remember everyone from those days." "I have to. My life depends on remembering." Tova waited. She swallowed carefully, then spoke again. "I need you to understand something. I can't go back to Fort Griffin. No matter what you think you should do, I cannot go back." "Why not?" Tess struggled to sit up. Tova helped her, propping her against his saddle. She stared into the fire before speaking. "Because Daniel is the reason I was in that sack. My husband tried to kill me 3 years ago. When I escaped, he spent 3 years making sure no one would believe me if I came back. 2 days ago, his men found me. They brought me to him, and he put me in that sack himself and left me on that canyon rim to die." The words hung in the night air, impossible and terrible. Tova stared at her, searching for signs of delirium or madness. He found neither. Tess Bowen was scared, exhausted and hurt, but she was completely lucid. "That's a serious accusation," Tova said carefully. "Daniel Bowen is a territorial judge." "I know what he is to them," Tess said bitterly. "I also know what he is to me, and I can prove it." She reached into the remnants of her dress with trembling hands, pulling out something small wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased, but intact. She held it out to Tova. He took it carefully, unfolding it in the firelight. It was a letter, written in a strong, masculine hand he recognized. He'd seen Daniel Bowen's signature on enough documents to know his handwriting. The letter was addressed to someone named Garrett. It laid out a plan in clinical detail. The staged raid, the fire, the substitute body, a Mexican woman purchased from Comancheros for this exact purpose. The method of ensuring Tess's disappearance looked like death. Every step was outlined with the precision of a lawyer covering his tracks. Tova read it twice, his hands tightening on the paper. When he looked up, his face was carefully neutral. "Where did you get this?" "I found it the night before the attack," Tess said quietly. "In Daniel's study. I couldn't sleep. He'd been acting strange for weeks. I went looking for answers and found this in a locked drawer. I had just finished reading it when I heard horses outside. I ran. The attack was real then. Oh, it was real. The Comancheros came just like the letter said. They burned the house. They killed the woman Daniel had prepared. I watched from the woods while everyone thought I was inside. Then I ran. Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Tess laughed bitterly. "Daniel is the authority. He's a judge. The sheriff is his friend. The marshal answers to the territorial government, full of Daniel's allies. Who would have believed me over him?" She had a point. A woman with no proof beyond a letter that could be dismissed as forgery, accusing a respected judge of attempted murder. The courts wouldn't have listened. "So you've been hiding for 3 years. Surviving," Tess corrected. "I made it to Mexico first, worked on a ranch near Chihuahua, then New Mexico Territory, took a job at Fort Union. I kept moving, always watching. I thought I'd gotten far enough away. I was wrong. Someone recognized me in a settlement 50 miles east. 2 days later, 3 men grabbed me. They took me to a line shack where Daniel came." She fell silent, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was flat. "He didn't say much, just looked at me like I was a problem he'd thought he'd solved. He had his men put the sack over my head and bind it. Then he told them to leave me on the canyon rim. He said the sun would finish what the fire should have done. Then he left." The fire crackled. Tova sat with the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of choice settling on his shoulders. He could take Tess back to Fort Griffin, present the letter as evidence. But Daniel had power, connections, 3 years of sympathy. Or he could help her run, give her supplies and a head start. It would be safer, simpler, but it would also mean letting a murderer continue wearing a judge's robe. It would mean injustice unpunished, truth buried under lies. Tova had spent 3 years working for the settlements because he believed in something better than the law of violence that had ruled the frontier. "I won't force you to do anything," Tova said finally. "But running isn't living, it's just dying slowly. If what you say is true, and I believe it is, then we need to find a way to make people hear it. Because if we don't, Daniel wins, and the next woman who inconveniences him will end up in a sack. They won't listen," Tess said, but her voice held less certainty. "Maybe not, but I have to believe there are people in this territory who care more about truth than politics. I have to believe that—" Tess stared at him for a long moment, searching his face. Finally, she nodded, barely. "All right, we'll try. But Tova, if this goes wrong, then I'll be standing between you and him," Tova said, and meant it. "I promise you that—" They sat in silence then, watching the fire burn down to coals, both knowing that come morning, everything would change. Tess Bowen was no longer dead, and that simple fact would shake the territory to its foundations. Dawn broke cold over the Llano Estacado, the sky shifting from black to deep purple to pale orange in the space of 30 minutes. Tova had been awake for an hour already, watching the stars fade one by one while Tess slept fitfully on his bedroll. She'd woken twice during the night, confused and frightened, reaching for weapons that weren't there before recognizing where she was. Each time, Tova had spoken quietly until she settled, then watched her sink back into exhausted sleep. Now, with morning light spreading across the plains, he built up the fire and set coffee to boil in his battered tin pot. The smell of it seemed to rouse Tess. Her eyes opened slowly, and for a moment she simply stared at the canvas roof of the lean-to, as if trying to remember how she'd come to be there. Then memory returned, and her face tightened with the weight of everything she'd told him the night before. "How do you feel?" Tova asked, crouching beside her with a cup of water. "Like I've been dragged behind a horse for 3 days, Tess said, her voice still rough but stronger than yesterday. She accepted the water and drank slowly, mindful of his earlier warnings. "But alive. That's more than I expected when the sun came up yesterday." Tova handed her hardtack soaked in coffee to soften it, along with more of the jerked beef. She ate mechanically, her mind clearly elsewhere. When she'd finished, she looked at him with an intensity that suggested she'd been thinking all night, even in sleep. "You said we'd try to make people listen. How exactly do you propose we do?" It was the question Tova had been wrestling with since the fire burned down to coals. Daniel Bowen wasn't just any man. He was a territorial judge with connections reaching all the way to Austin and maybe beyond. He had the respect of every prominent citizen in Fort Griffin. He had money, position, and the sympathy that came from being a widower who'd lost his wife tragically. Against all that, Tess had a letter that could be dismissed as forgery and the testimony of a woman who'd been declared dead 3 years ago. "We need allies," Tova said finally. "People with standing in the territory who can't be dismissed or intimidated. People who care more about justice than political convenience." "Such people exist?" Tess asked, skepticism heavy in her voice. "They have to," Tova replied. "Otherwise, this whole experiment in civilization is just another form of violence." Dressed up in better clothes, he'd been thinking about the territorial marshal, a man named Coleman Webb, who'd hired Tova for tracking work several times over the past 2 years. Webb had a reputation for honesty that seemed genuine rather than performative. He'd prosecuted wealthy ranchers for land fraud and hadn't backed down when threatened. More importantly, he reported directly to the territorial governor, not to local judges like Daniel. "There's a marshal I've worked with," Tova said. "Coleman Webb. He's based out of Austin but travels the circuit regularly. He was supposed to be in Fort Concho this month, about 60 miles south of here. If we can reach him before Daniel learns you're alive, we might have a chance. Tess considered this, her fingers unconsciously touching the oilcloth packet that held the letter. And if this marshal doesn't believe me, then we keep looking until we find someone who will, Tova said flatly. But we can't do anything while you're in this condition. You need at least 2 more days to recover enough for travel. That means staying here, staying hidden, and hoping no one stumbles across this camp. As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the plains. Tova's hand went to his rifle instantly, and he moved to the edge of the lean-to, where he could see without being easily seen. A single rider approached from the west, leading a pack mule. Even at a distance, Tova recognized the easy posture. In the saddle and the distinctive grey horse. "Someone's coming," Tess whispered, fear sharp in her voice. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her yet. "Stay down," Tova said quietly. "I know him. Let me handle this." The rider was Marcus Chen, a half-Chinese freighter who ran supplies between Fort Griffin and the smaller settlements scattered across the territory. Tova had known him for 5 years, trusted him more than most. Chen was one of those rare frontier men who seemed to operate on principles rather than convenience. He'd once traveled 40 miles out of his way to return money he'd been accidentally overpaid, and he'd sheltered a runaway slave family in his wagon during the war, despite the danger. Chen reined in 30 yards from camp and called out in his distinctive accent, flavored by his Cantonese father and Irish mother. "Tova, you in there?" "It's Marcus. I've got news you need to hear." Tova stepped into view, rifle lowered but ready. "You're a long way from the freight roads, Marcus. Looking for you specifically," Chen said, dismounting. He was a compact man, shorter than Tova but built solid, with weathered features that made his age hard to guess. "Word came through Fort Griffin yesterday. Judge Bowen is offering a reward. $500 for information about a Comanche scout seen in the canyon country. Said you might have witnessed something related to a criminal matter." Tova's stomach tightened. $500 was a fortune on the frontier, enough to make even honest men consider betrayal. What kind of criminal matter? Didn't say. But he's got men riding out to every camp and settlement within 100 miles, asking questions, showing your description. Chen's eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Whatever you're involved in, Tova, it's serious enough that the judge is spending real money and political capital to find you." Behind Tova, inside the lean-to, he heard Tess's sharp intake of breath. Chen heard it too. His expression shifted from concern to deeply curious. "You're not alone," Tova made a decision. He'd known Marcus Chen for 5 years, and he'd watched the man's character in situations where character showed itself most clearly. If they needed allies, they had to start somewhere. "Marcus, I need you to listen to something that's going to sound impossible. And then I need you to decide whether you're the kind of man I think you are." Chen's hand drifted toward the revolver on his hip. Not drawing, but ready. "I'm listening." "The person with me is Teresa Bowen, Daniel Bowen's wife. The woman who supposedly died 3 years ago." Marcus Chen stood very still for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he said quietly, "I attended that funeral. I watched them bury her." "They buried someone," Tova said, "but not her." "Come inside, Marcus. Look at her face. Then decide if I'm lying." Chen approached slowly, cautiously, his hand still near his weapon. When he reached the lean-to and saw Tess sitting against the saddle, her face still showing the damage from sun and exposure, but undeniably recognizable, he stopped, as if he'd walked into a wall. The color drained from his face. "Sweet, merciful God," he whispered. Tess met his eyes steadily. "Hello, Marcus. I remember you. You delivered furniture to the ranch house the month before I died. A rocking chair from a catalog. You refused payment because you said the chair had a scratch. You said you'd fix it yourself and barely noticed," Marcus finished, his voice hollow with shock. He looked at Tova, then back at Tess, then at Tova again. "How is this possible?" "Sit down," Tova said. "This is going to take some time." Over the next hour, while the sun climbed higher and the day grew warm, Tess told her story again. She showed Marcus the letter, let him read it carefully, answered his questions with the patience of someone who'd been waiting 3 years to finally speak truth. Marcus listened without interrupting, his face growing darker as the full scope of Daniel Bowen's plan became clear. When Tess finished, Marcus sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the letter in his hands. Finally, he looked up at Tova. "You believe her? I found her dying on a canyon rim, wrapped in a sack." "Yes, I believe her. And you're planning to do what exactly?" "Take this to the authorities." "Tova, Daniel Bowen is the authorities." "We're going to find Marshal Webb," Tova said. "He's outside Daniel's influence. If anyone can bring a case against a territorial judge, it's him." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Webb was reassigned 2 weeks ago. He's up in the Oklahoma Territory now, won't be back in Texas until winter. I heard it from the deputy marshal in Fort Griffin. The territorial government shuffled some positions around. The news hit like a physical blow. Tova had been counting on Webb, on his reputation for integrity. Without him, their options narrowed dangerously. Then we find someone else." "Who?" Marcus asked flatly. "Every lawman within 200 miles answers to either Daniel directly or to people who owe him favors. Every merchant, every rancher, every town council. He spent 3 years building influence, while everyone felt sorry for the grieving widower. You think they're going to turn on him because a woman they buried 3 years ago suddenly appears with a convenient letter?" "It's not convenient. It's evidence," Tova said, heat in his voice. "Evidence that will be called forgery before you finish presenting it," Marcus countered. "Evidence that will be dismissed by men who have too much invested in Daniel's goodwill to question it. You're not thinking this through, Tova. You're thinking like a man who believes justice happens because it should. I'm thinking like a man who's seen power protect itself 100 times. Tess spoke up quietly. "He's right. I've had 3 years to think about this. I've imagined every scenario. They all end the same way." "So what are you suggesting?" Tova demanded. "That we just let him win?" "I'm suggesting we be smarter about this," Marcus said. He stood and paced the small camp, his mind clearly working. "Daniel's hunting for you, specifically, Tova. That means he knows Tess is alive, or at least suspects it. He can't afford to let her surface and start talking. But he also can't make too obvious a move without raising questions. Right now, he's in a delicate position." "How does that help us?" Tova asked. "It helps us because it means he's scared," Marcus said. "Scared men make mistakes. They overreach. They show their hand when they should keep it hidden. What we need is to make him more scared, make him desperate enough to do something that reveals his guilt to people who can't ignore it." Tess looked at Marcus with new interest. "What exactly do you have in mind?" Marcus stopped pacing and looked at them both. "We make Daniel think Tess is planning to surface publicly. We let him hear rumors that she's alive, that she's gathering witnesses, that she's preparing to make accusations. We make him feel like the walls are closing in, and we watch what he does, who he contacts, what arrangements he makes. Desperate men reach out to accomplices. They activate networks. They leave trails. That's dangerous," Tova said. "If Daniel thinks she's about to expose him, he'll come at her with everything he has." "He's already doing that," Marcus pointed out. "The difference is now we'll be ready. Now we'll be controlling the information he receives. And now we'll have help, your help," Tova said. "My help," Marcus confirmed. "I move through this territory freely. I hear things. I can spread rumors, gather information, watch Daniel's reactions. And I can be in places you can't, talk to people who wouldn't talk to either of you." Tess studied Marcus carefully. "Why would you risk this? You barely know me. If Daniel finds out you're helping..." "I've been thinking about leaving the territory anyway," Marcus said, though his tone suggested this wasn't the whole truth. "The freight business is getting too competitive, and I'm tired of watching powerful men abuse their positions while everyone pretends not to notice. Maybe I'm just tired of being silent. Maybe that's reason enough." The 3 of them sat in heavy silence, the weight of the decision pressing down. Finally, Tova spoke. "If we do this, we need to be careful. One mistake and Daniel will bury all of us. Then we don't make mistakes, Marcus said simply. We plan every step. We watch every angle. And we make damn sure that when Daniel Bowen falls, he falls hard enough that he can't get back up. Tess looked between them, something like hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since Tova had found her. You really think this could work? I think it's the only chance we have, Marcus said. Daniel's strength is his reputation and his connections. We turn those into weaknesses. We make people question. We make them doubt. And we document everything so that when the moment comes, the evidence is overwhelming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tova felt something shift in his chest, the cold weight of doubt warming into something that might have been determination. All right, we try it your way, Marcus. But first, Tess needs to recover. She can't do anything in her current condition. I can move her to a safer location, Marcus offered. I've got a line shack about 20 miles north that no one knows about. Used to belong to my father-in-law before he died. It's stocked with supplies and completely off any regular routes. She can recover there while we start laying groundwork. I don't want to be hidden away, Tess protested. Not again. I've spent 3 years hiding. 2 more weeks, Marcus said firmly. 2 weeks to heal and to prepare. Then we make our move. But we do it smart, we do it careful, and we do it in a way that doesn't get all of us killed. Agreed, Tess looked at Tova, who nodded slowly. Agreed, she said finally. 2 weeks. But then we act. Marcus moved to his pack mule and began unloading supplies. Fresh bandages, proper food, clean clothes that had belonged to his late wife. He worked with the efficiency of a man who'd planned for this conversation before arriving. Tova realized with a start that Marcus had already made his decision before riding into camp. Had already chosen his side based on nothing more than Tova's character and his own principles. You knew you were going to help us before you got here, Tova said quietly. I suspected what you'd found when I heard about Daniel's reward, Marcus admitted. The timing was too convenient, the amount too large. Daniel Bowen doesn't spend $500 unless he's protecting something valuable. I figured you'd stumbled onto whatever that something was. When I got here and saw her, it all made sense. You could have turned around and collected that reward, Tova pointed out. I could have, Marcus agreed. I also could have kept the money I was overpaid 5 years ago, or turned away that family during the war, or done 100 other things that would have been easier and more profitable. But then I'd have to live with being the kind of man who does those things. And I decided a long time ago that money's not worth the price of my sleep. By midday, they had a plan. Marcus would return to Fort Griffin and begin carefully spreading rumors. Nothing specific, just hints and suggestions that would reach Daniel's ears. A freighter asking too many questions about the old Bowen Ranch fire. A scout who'd been seen in the canyon country acting suspicious. Small seeds of worry that would grow into larger concerns. Meanwhile, Tova would move Tess to the line shack Marcus described. She'd recover there, protected and hidden, while preparing her testimony. They'd gather any additional evidence they could find. Talk to anyone who might have seen something 3 years ago. Build a case that couldn't be ignored. 2 weeks, Marcus repeated as he prepared to leave. Then we meet at the line shack and decide our next move based on what we've learned. If Daniel's made mistakes, we'll know. If he's reached out to accomplices, we'll have names. And if we're very lucky, he'll have done something stupid enough that we can use it. He mounted his gray horse and looked down at them both. Be careful. Daniel's dangerous precisely because people underestimate how far he'll go. He murdered his wife once already. He won't hesitate to do it again. We'll be careful, Tova promised. Marcus nodded and turned his horse west, back toward Fort Griffin and the dangerous game they were about to play. Tova watched him until he disappeared into the heat shimmer, then turned back to find Tess staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're risking everything for me, she said quietly. Your reputation, your livelihood, maybe your life. Why? Tova considered the question. thought about all the easy lies he could tell, then chose truth instead. Because 3 years ago, when you supposedly died, I believed what everyone else believed. I thought you'd been difficult, demanding, that maybe you'd push Daniel into the desperate work that got him away from home. I believed the stories without questioning them, and that makes me complicit in what happened to you. That's not your fault. Maybe not, Tova said. But it's my responsibility now. We all have a responsibility to question the stories we're told, especially when those stories are convenient for powerful people. I failed that responsibility once. I won't fail it again. Tess nodded slowly, understanding. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the move to Marcus's line shack. Tova packed his camp carefully, leaving no sign they'd been there. He helped Tess practice walking, supporting her when her legs threatened to give out, watching her determination push through pain and exhaustion. As the sun set and they prepared for one more night in the draw before tomorrow's journey, Tess spoke again. Tova, if this doesn't work, if Daniel finds us before we can expose him, then we make sure the truth doesn't die with us, Tova said. We write it down, we hide copies, we make sure that someday, somehow, people know what really happened. Even if we don't live to see justice done, we can make sure it comes eventually. That's not very comforting, Tess said, but she was almost smiling. Comfort's overrated, Tova replied. Truth matters more. They sat by the fire as stars emerged overhead, two people bound by circumstance and choice into an alliance that would either bring down a powerful man or get them both killed. Neither outcome was certain, but for the first time since Tova had pulled that burlap sack away and recognized Tess's face, he felt something other than shock and dread. He felt purpose. And on the frontier, where life was cheap and justice was rare, purpose was sometimes the only thing worth having. The line shack sat in a shallow valley 12 miles north of the Canadian River breaks, hidden among a stand of cottonwoods that marked an underground spring. Marcus Chen's father-in-law had built it 20 years earlier as a line camp for winter cattle operations. But the old man had died, and Marcus had kept the place secret, using it occasionally when he needed solitude or when his freight routes brought him through this empty quarter of the territory. Tova helped Tess down from the horse, steadying her as her feet touched ground that still felt uncertain beneath her. The ride had taken most of the day, moving slowly to accommodate her weakness, and she was exhausted. But the shack was solid, weather-tight, with a stove that worked and shutters that could be barred from inside. More importantly, it was invisible from any regular trail, tucked into terrain that most travelers avoided. It's perfect, Tess said, looking at the rough structure with something like relief. No one would think to look here. That's the idea, Tova replied. He'd been scanning the surrounding country throughout their approach, looking for any sign they'd been followed or observed. Nothing, just empty grassland and the endless sky. Still, his instincts whispered warnings. Daniel Bowen had resources and determination. Underestimating him would be fatal. Inside, the shack was spare but functional. 2 rope beds with corn shuck mattresses, a table, 2 chairs, shelves stocked with canned goods and dried supplies. A lantern hung from a ceiling beam, and firewood was stacked neatly beside the stove. Marcus had clearly prepared the place before leading them here, adding fresh supplies and making sure everything was ready. Tess sank onto one of the beds with a sigh of relief mixed with exhaustion. The ride had cost her, though she'd never complained. Tova could see pain in the tightness around her eyes, in the careful way she moved. Her feet were still healing, her hands still bandaged. Another week before she'd be anything close to fully recovered. Rest, Tova said, setting down their packs. I'm going to scout the area, make sure we're alone. He spent 2 hours circling outward from the shack in expanding rings, reading the ground for tracks, watching for disturbances in the natural pattern of the landscape. He found deer sign, coyote tracks, the distinctive scratching of wild turkeys. No human presence except their own. Satisfied, he returned to find Tess sitting at the table with the letter spread before her, staring at Daniel's handwriting as if she could burn it with her eyes alone. I keep thinking about what Marcus said. She spoke without looking up, about making Daniel desperate, watching him make mistakes. But what if he doesn't make mistakes? What if he's too smart for that? Everyone makes mistakes when they're scared, Tova said, settling into the other chair. The question is whether we're positioned to see them when they happen, and if we're not, then we adapt. We find another way. Tova leaned forward. Tess, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Daniel's associations. Who did he meet with regularly? Who benefited from his legal work? Who might have helped him 3 years ago? Tess closed her eyes, thinking. There was a man named Garrett, the one the letter was addressed to. I never met him, but Daniel mentioned him occasionally. Said he handled difficult situations. I always thought he meant legal situations, but now you think he meant other kinds of difficulties. Yes. Tess opened her eyes. There was also Harrison Polk, the banker in Fort Griffin. Daniel borrowed money from him to expand the ranch. They had dinner together at least once a month. And there was Sheriff Wade, but everyone knows their friends. Anyone else? Anyone who seemed particularly close to Daniel, or who might have had reason to help him. Tess frowned, reaching back through 3 years of memories that she'd probably tried to bury. There was a woman, Lydia Morland. She came from Austin several times that last year. Daniel said she was related to the territorial governor, that he was cultivating the connection for political reasons. I thought it was just ambition at the time, but looking back, the way they spoke to each other, you think they were involved. I think she was the reason he wanted me gone, Tess said flatly. I think Lydia Morland was the future he wanted, and I was the obstacle in his way. Tova filed the name away. If Daniel had been involved with a woman connected to the territorial government, that relationship might still exist. It might be leverage or it might be a liability, depending on how it was used. What about the men who grabbed you 2 days ago? Did you recognize any of them? One of them, Tess said. Jake Morrison. He worked for Daniel at the ranch, handled the rough stock, been disposition good with violence. The other 2 I didn't know, but they followed his lead. So Daniel still has Morrison in his employ, which means he's kept at least some of his old network active. Tova stood and moved to the window, looking out at the fading daylight. That's useful. Morrison is the kind of man who'll make mistakes eventually. Men like that always do. They spent the evening going through everything Tess could remember, building a map of Daniel's connections and associations. It was fragmentary, full of gaps and uncertainties, but it was a start. Tova wrote it all down in a small journal he carried, knowing that memory was unreliable and that they'd need details later. Night fell completely, and Tova built a small fire in the stove, just enough for warmth and to heat beans for their supper. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared purpose rather than forced conversation. Tess was stronger than she'd been 2 days ago, color returning to her face, movements less pained. Give her another week and she'd be ready for whatever came next. Tell me about yourself, Tess said suddenly. I knew you when you worked for the ranch, but I never really knew you. How does a man become a scout for settlements he's not fully part of? Tova considered the question, surprised by it. My mother was Comanche, my father was Mexican. They grew up between worlds, not fully belonging to either. When the settlement started expanding after the war, I realized I could be useful as someone who understood both sides. So I became a scout, a translator, a bridge. It's not a comfortable position, but it's mine. Do you regret it? Being between worlds? Sometimes, Tova admitted. It would be easier to choose a side, to be fully one thing or another. But maybe easier isn't always better. Maybe the world needs people who can stand in the middle and see both directions. Tess nodded slowly. I understand that more than you might think. I was always between worlds too. Too educated for the frontier, too independent for Philadelphia society. Daniel liked that about me at first, or said he did. Later I think he resented it. His loss, Tova said simply. They talked long into the night, sharing pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden from most people. It created a bond deeper than their alliance of convenience, something that felt like genuine friendship. When they finally slept, Tova on one bed and Tess on the other, It was the first night since he'd found her that neither of them woke in fear. 3 days passed quietly. Tova hunted, bringing back rabbits and prairie chickens. Tess grew stronger, able to walk short distances without pain, able to help with camp tasks. They established a routine, comfortable and almost peaceful. But both knew it was temporary, a calm before whatever storm Marcus was stirring up in Fort Griffin. On the 4th day, Marcus returned. He rode in at midday, his grey horse showing signs of hard travel. Tova met him outside while Tess waited in the doorway. Marcus's face was tight with tension. "It's working," Marcus said without preamble. "Daniel's scared. I've never seen him like this. He's calling in favors, pressuring people, asking questions that make him look desperate." "What kind of questions?" Tova asked. "About you, specifically. Where you might camp, who you associate with, whether anyone's seen you with a woman. He's offering money, lots of it, and he's not being subtle anymore. That's not like him. Daniel Bowen is usually careful, calculated. Now he's acting like a man who knows his time is running out." Marcus dismounted and followed them inside, accepting water and sitting heavily at the table. "There's more. I made some inquiries about this Garrett person, the one mentioned in the letter. Found a freight contractor named Garrett Sloan, who operates out of Austin. He has a reputation for handling problems that need to disappear. Nothing proven but rumors. The kind of rumors that follow certain men in certain lines of work. Can we connect him to Daniel?" Tess asked. "Not directly, not yet. But I found a man who worked for Sloan 3 years ago. He's willing to talk for a price. Says he knows things about a job Sloan took in the Fort Griffin area around the time of your supposed death. He wouldn't give details until he sees money, but he seemed genuinely nervous, like he's been carrying knowledge that could get him killed." Tova exchanged glances with Tess. "How much does he want?" $100. "It's a lot, but if he can connect Sloan to Daniel, if he can testify about what really happened—" "I have money," Tess interrupted. "I've been saving for 3 years, living on almost nothing. I have nearly $300 hidden in my belongings. If this man's information is solid, 100 is nothing," Marcus nodded. "I'll arrange a meeting, but there's something else you need to know. Lydia Morland is in Fort Griffin. She arrived 2 days ago, staying at the hotel. She and Daniel have been seen together multiple times, and they're not being discreet anymore. Whatever relationship they have, it's out in the open now." "That's bold," Tova observed. "Almost reckless or confident," Marcus countered. "Like he thinks he's about to solve his problem permanently and doesn't need to hide anymore." The implications hung heavy in the air. Daniel wasn't just scared, he was preparing for an endgame. That made him more dangerous, but also more vulnerable. A man planning his next move carefully left fewer openings than a man rushing toward a conclusion. "We need to move faster," Tess said. "If Daniel's preparing something, we can't wait 2 weeks. We need to gather our evidence and present it before he can act." "Present it to who?" Marcus asked. "That's still the question we haven't answered. Every official in this territory either answers to Daniel or owes him something." "What about the newspapers?" Tova said suddenly. The territorial press. If we can get the story published, make it public before Daniel can suppress it." Marcus considered this. "There's a newspaper in Austin, the Sentinel. The editor is a man named Thomas Crawford. He has a reputation for publishing things that embarrass powerful people. Got run out of Louisiana for exposing corruption in the Reconstruction government. If anyone would print this story, it's him." "Then that's our target," Tess said decisively. "We gather everything we have. We get testimony from this man who worked for Sloan, and we take it all to Crawford. Once it's published, Daniel can't make it disappear. The truth will be out. It's risky," Marcus warned. "If Crawford decides not to publish, or if Daniel learns what we're planning before the story runs, everything's risky," Tova cut in. "But this is the first real strategy we've had. We use Daniel's desperation against him. We document his mistakes, and we make sure the evidence reaches someone who will actually do something with it." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Marcus would arrange the meeting with Sloan's former employee, would gather any other evidence he could find in Fort Griffin. Tova would take Tess to Austin, keeping off main roads and avoiding settlements where they might be recognized. Once in Austin, they'd approach Crawford with their story and their evidence. "How long will it take to reach Austin?" Tess asked. "Week, maybe 8 days if we're careful," Tova said. "We can't risk the main roads, so we'll have to take the long way around. But that gives Marcus time to gather more information and meet us there with whatever he finds. I'll need 3 days to arrange the meeting with Sloane's man and put together everything I can dig up," Marcus said. "Then another 4 to reach Austin. So 10 days total. We should plan to meet at the Sentinel office on the morning of the 10th day from now." The plan was taking shape, becoming real. For the first time since finding Tess on the canyon rim, Tova felt like they were moving forward rather than simply reacting. It was a good feeling, though he knew better than to trust it completely. Marcus left before sunset, riding hard to get back to Fort Griffin before his absence was noted. Tova and Tess spent the evening preparing for their own journey. Tova checked their weapons, planned their route, calculated how much food and water they'd need. Tess went through her belongings, finding the money she'd mentioned and counting it carefully. $317, she said. 3 years of wages from odd jobs, minus what I needed to survive. "It's everything I have. We'll use it carefully," Tova promised. "And when this is over, when Daniel's exposed and you're safe, you'll have a chance to build a real life again." "If I'm alive to build it," Tess said, but without bitterness. She was simply acknowledging reality. They were gambling everything on a plan that had dozens of points where it could fail. Optimism would be foolish. That night, as they lay in their separate beds waiting for sleep, Tess spoke into the darkness. "Tova, if something happens to me, if Daniel catches up with us before we reach Austin—" "Nothing's going to happen," Tova said. "But if it does," Tess persisted, "promise me you'll still go to the newspaper. Promise me you'll tell the story, even if I'm not there to tell it myself." "Don't let Daniel win because I'm dead." "I promise," Tova said quietly. "But you're going to live, Tess. You've survived 3 years. You'll survive this too." He heard her shift on the bed, settling into whatever comfort she could find. "I hope you're right," she whispered. Tova lay awake long after Tess's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep. Through the window, he could see stars scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds. Somewhere under those same stars, Daniel Bowen was planning his next move. Somewhere, Marcus Chen was gathering evidence that might bring a powerful man down. And here, in a hidden line shack in empty country, 2 people were preparing to risk everything on the chance that truth still mattered in a world that often seemed to care only for power. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters slightly. Tova listened to it and thought about the conversation they'd had earlier, about being between worlds. He'd spent his whole life in that uncomfortable middle ground, not fully Comanche and not fully Mexican, not fully part of the settlements, but working for them anyway. It had made him a good scout, because he could see from multiple perspectives, could understand motivations that others missed. Now that same quality might help him understand Daniel Bowen well enough to predict his moves, to anticipate his strategies. Daniel was a man between worlds too, in his own way. A man trying to bridge frontier justice and civilized law, using whichever served his purposes at any given moment. That flexibility had made him powerful, but flexibility could also be fragility if you pushed it too far. Tova finally drifted towards sleep, with that thought circling in his mind. They were all between worlds in different ways, all trying to survive in the spaces where different rules collided. The difference was that some people used those spaces to help others, while some used them only to help themselves. The coming days would show which kind of person prevailed. His last conscious thought was of the letter, of Daniel's handwriting laying out murder with the same careful precision he'd probably used for legal briefs. That coldness, that calculation might be Daniel's greatest weakness. Men who planned everything down to the smallest detail often had trouble adapting when their plans went wrong. And Tova intended to make sure everything went as wrong as possible. Outside, the wind continued its restless movement across the plains, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of storms to come. In 10 days, they'd be in Austin. In 10 days, they'd either have started the process of bringing Daniel Bowen to justice, or they'd be dead. The odds weren't good, but they were the only odds they had. The first 2 days of travel passed without incident, which made Tova more nervous rather than less. They moved through country he knew well, staying off established trails and keeping to the low ground where they'd be harder to spot from a distance. Tess rode better than he'd expected, her body remembering skills she must have learned during her years of running. She didn't complain about the pace or the rough terrain, just kept her eyes forward and her questions to herself. They crossed the salt fork of the Brazos at dawn on the 3rd day, the water running shallow enough that the horses barely wet their bellies. On the far bank, Tova paused to let the animals drink while he studied their back trail. Nothing moved in the early morning light except a hawk circling high above, hunting for breakfast. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, a prickle between his shoulder blades that wouldn't go away. "You feel it too," Tess said quietly. She dismounted and stood beside her horse, one hand on the animal's neck, her eyes scanning the same empty landscape Tova had been watching. "Maybe just nerves," Tova replied, though he didn't believe it. "We're exposed out here. Makes a man jumpy, or maybe Daniel's men are better trackers than we thought," Tess said. "Maybe they picked up our trail from the line shack." Tova had considered that possibility. Marcus had been careful when he visited, but 3 sets of tracks were harder to hide than one. If Daniel had sent men specifically to watch for Marcus, if they'd followed him without his knowledge, then the line shack's location might already be compromised, which meant pursuit could be closer than they'd realized. "We keep moving," Tova decided. "Put distance between us and anyone who might be following. There's a settlement called Cedar Springs, about 15 miles southeast. Small place, just a trading post and a few houses. We can resupply there and hear any news that's traveling." They mounted again and pushed on, covering ground at a steady pace that ate up miles without exhausting the horses. The country grew rougher as they traveled, cut by dry washes and scattered with rock outcroppings that offered both cover and danger. Twice Tova led them through narrow defiles where ambush would be easy, his rifle ready and his nerves singing with tension. Both times they emerged safely, but the feeling of pursuit never faded. Cedar Springs appeared in the afternoon heat like a mirage that turned solid as they approached. The trading post was a low adobe structure with a covered porch, where 3 men sat in chairs, watching the road with the bored attention of people who had nothing better to do. Tova recognized the type immediately, drifters and hired guns who floated between settlements, looking for work that didn't ask too many questions. "Stay close," he murmured to Tess as they rode toward the post. "Don't give them any reason to remember you." The men on the porch straightened as Tova and Tess dismounted. One of them, a lean man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, stood and moved to the edge of the porch. His hand rested casually near the revolver on his hip, the gesture meant to be noticed. "Help you folks?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather not. "Just need supplies," Tova said neutrally. "Water, food, maybe grain for the horses if you have it." "We got supplies," the scarred man said. "Question is whether you got money to pay for them." Tova let the insult pass without reaction. Men like this tested everyone they met, looking for weakness or an excuse for violence. Responding would only escalate the situation. "I've got money, and we're not looking for trouble. Nobody ever is," one of the other men said, laughing. "Right up until trouble finds them anyway." Tess had stayed by the horses, keeping her face turned away and her hat pulled low. Smart woman, Tova thought. The less these men saw of her, the less they'd have to report if someone came asking questions later. He tied the horses to the porch rail and moved past the men into the trading post's dim interior. Inside, the post was cramped and poorly stocked. Shelves holding a sparse collection of goods that suggested business wasn't exactly thriving. A heavy woman behind the counter looked up as Tova entered, her expression weary. "Help you?" she asked without enthusiasm. Tova purchased flour, coffee, jerked beef and grain for the horses, paying with coins from the pouch Tess had given him. The woman counted the money carefully, then gathered his purchases without conversation. As she worked, Tova studied the notices tacked to the wall behind her. Wanted posters mostly, rewards for cattle thieves and army deserters. And there, among them, something new, a notice offering $500 for information, leading to the location of a Comanche scout named Tova, last seen in the canyon country north of Fort Griffin. The notice was dated 4 days ago and signed by Judge Daniel Bowen. It described Tova in detail and mentioned that he might be traveling with a woman of uncertain description. "That you?" the woman asked, following his gaze to the poster. "Do I look like a man worth $500? Tova replied, forcing his voice to stay light. "You look like a man who's maybe running from something," the woman said. "Most men who come through here are. Don't much care what it is, long as you pay and don't cause trouble in my post." "Fair enough," Tova said. He gathered his purchases and turned to leave, then paused. "That poster, how long ago did it go up?" "Ryder brought it 2 days back. Been putting them up at every settlement and crossroads between here and Fort Griffin. Whatever you done, somebody wants you found real bad." Tova nodded his thanks and stepped back outside. The 3 men on the porch were still there, and now they were looking at him with more interest. The scarred man's eyes moved from Tova to the horses to Tess, who still stood with her back turned. Recognition dawned slowly on his face. "Comanche scout," he said slowly. "Traveling with a woman. $500. Tova's hand moved to his rifle, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet. You'd have to take me to collect that money. You sure you want to try?" The scarred man considered this, weighing greed against risk. His companions shifted nervously, clearly less eager for confrontation. Finally the scarred man smiled, showing gaps where teeth should have been. "Reckon I'll let you ride out. 500 ain't worth dying over. But I expect others might feel different." "I expect they might," Tova agreed. He loaded the supplies onto his horse, keeping the 3 men in his peripheral vision. Tess mounted smoothly, still keeping her face hidden. Tova followed suit, and they turned their horses south, away from the trading post. "Don't run," Tova said quietly as they started moving. "It'll make them think we're easy prey. Just ride steady like we've got every right to be here." They maintained that steady pace for half a mile, until Cedar Springs was out of sight behind them. Then Tova kicked his horse into a canter, and Tess matched him without question. They covered 3 miles fast before Tova slowed again, looking for a place to hide their trail. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "They'll send word," Tess said, stating the obvious. "Those men will tell someone about us, and Daniel will know which direction we're heading." "Maybe," Tova said. "Or maybe they'll sit on the information, hoping to collect the reward themselves. Either way, we have to assume we're being hunted now. No more settlements, no more contact with people. We travel at night when we can and hide during the day." The change in strategy cost them time, but bought them safety. They found a draw with good cover and fresh water, and there they waited for darkness. Tess used the time to rebandage her feet, which had started bleeding again from the long hours in the saddle. She didn't mention the pain, but Tova saw it in the careful way she moved. "We can rest here a full day if you need it," he offered. "We don't have a full day," Tess replied. "Marcus will be in Austin in 6 more days. We need to be there when he arrives." She was right, but pushing too hard would break them both. Tova compromised, deciding they'd rest here until midnight, then travel through the cool hours before dawn. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best balance between speed and caution. As they waited for night, Tess spoke suddenly. "Tell me about Austin." "I've never been there." "It's a real city," Tova said. "Not like these frontier settlements. Brick buildings, paved streets in some places, actual law that doesn't depend on who has the most guns. The territorial government sits there, which means politicians and lawyers and people who think words matter more than bullets." "Sounds civilized," Tess said with faint irony. "Sounds like a place where truth might actually count for something," Tova corrected. "That's what we're betting on anyway." They lapsed into silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Tova found himself wondering what would happen if they actually succeeded, if they exposed Daniel and survived the exposure. Would Tess stay in Texas or flee to some distant territory where her past couldn't follow? Would Tova be able to continue working as a scout, or would his involvement in bringing down a territorial judge make him unemployable? The future was a blank space, terrifying and full of possibility. Night fell completely, and a quarter moon rose to light their way. They mounted and rode south by southeast, following dry creek beds and game trails that offered cover from distant observation. The country was different at night, mysterious and full of sounds that daylight hid. Coyotes called to each other across the darkness. Nightbirds hunted on silent wings. When something large moved through brush nearby, probably a deer, but possibly something more dangerous. Tova kept his rifle ready. They traveled until the eastern sky began to pale with approaching dawn, then found shelter in a cluster of rocks that offered shade and a view of their back trail. Tova took first watch while Tess slept, her exhaustion overcoming the discomfort of sleeping on hard ground. He studied the country they'd crossed, looking for any sign of pursuit. There, movement in the distance, visible only because the growing light threw long shadows. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving in the same direction Tova and Tess had traveled. Too far away to identify, but the fact that they were on the same trail was no coincidence. The men from Cedar Springs had talked, or someone else had picked up their trail. Either way, they were being followed. Tova woke Tess quietly. "We've got company. 4 riders about 2 miles back." Tess was alert instantly, fear and determination warring on her face. "How long do we have?" "An hour, maybe 2 if they lose our trail. But they're tracking us, which means they're good at it. Can we outrun them?" Tova considered their horses, both good animals, but tired from days of hard travel. "Not in a straight race, but we don't have to outrun them. We just have to lose them." He'd been studying the terrain during his watch, noting the rock formations and the way water had carved the landscape into a maze of washes and gullies. There was a section about a mile ahead, where the ground became broken and confused, multiple paths leading in different directions. If they could reach it before their pursuers got close enough to maintain visual contact, they might be able to disappear. They mounted and moved quickly but carefully, Tova using every trick he knew to obscure their trail. They rode through rocky sections where hoofprints wouldn't show. They backtracked and circled, creating false trails that led nowhere. When they reached the broken country Tova had spotted, he led them through a narrow defile that split into 3 separate channels. "Which way?" Tess asked. "All of them," Tova said. He dismounted and spent precious minutes leading his horse down each channel for 30 yards, leaving clear tracks, then backing out carefully and obscuring his retreat. When he finished, anyone following would find 3 equally convincing trails, and no way to know which was real without investigating all 3. He and Tess took the middle channel, which curved back to the north before turning east again. It was a risk, bringing them temporarily closer to their pursuers, but it was also the path their followers would be least likely to expect. They moved quickly through the channel, which deepened into a proper canyon with walls 20 feet high. Behind them, faintly, Tova heard voices. The pursuers had reached the split and were arguing about which path to take. Good. Argument meant delay, and delay meant distance. He urged his horse faster, Tess keeping pace, both of them focused on putting as much ground as possible between themselves and the men behind them. The canyon opened into a wide valley dotted with cedar trees. Tova led them into the thickest stand of trees he could find, then dismounted and covered their tracks as best he could with fallen branches and leaves. It wasn't perfect, but it might be enough if their pursuers were in a hurry. They waited in tense silence, listening. Voices grew louder, then faded as the pursuers chose one of the other channels. Tova waited an additional hour before moving again, wanting to be certain the danger had passed. When they finally emerged from the cedar stand and continued south, the sun was well up and the day was growing hot. "That won't be the last time," Tess said quietly. Daniel will keep sending men until we're caught or dead. Then we make sure we reach Austin before his men catch up, Tova replied. We're 4 days out now, maybe 3 if we push hard. Once we're in the city, we'll have crowds to hide in and witnesses to keep us safe. Daniel can't act as freely there. I hope you're right, Tess said. They traveled through the day, abandoning caution for speed now that they knew pursuit was close. The horses were tired but game, sensing their riders' urgency. Twice more Tova spotted distant riders and changed course to avoid them. Whether they were Daniel's men or just innocent travelers, he couldn't risk finding out. That night they made a cold camp with no fire, eating jerked beef and hardtack while sitting in darkness. Tess was quiet, withdrawn into herself in a way she hadn't been before. Tova understood. The reality of being hunted was wearing on her, eroding the hope that had built up over the past week. We're going to make it, he said quietly. 3 more days, Tess. 3 more days, and we'll be telling your story to someone who can actually do something about it. And if the newspaper won't publish it, Tess asked. If this editor Crawford decides the story is too dangerous or that he doesn't believe us, then we find someone else. Another newspaper, a federal marshal, someone in the territorial government who isn't in Daniel's pocket. We keep trying until someone listens. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, Tova admitted. It's probably going to be the hardest thing either of us ever does. But the alternative is letting Daniel win, and I can't accept that. Can you? Tess looked at him in the darkness, her face barely visible. No, she said finally. I can't accept that either. I've run for 3 years. I'm done running. They sat together in the darkness, 2 people who'd found themselves allied against forces much larger than themselves. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles. Somewhere behind them, men with guns and bad intentions were searching. Somewhere ahead in Austin, there might be help or there might be nothing, but they were moving forward, and that had to be enough. Dawn came again, the 4th day of their journey. Tova's body ached from days in the saddle, and he could see similar exhaustion in Tess, despite her attempts to hide it. But they mounted again and rode south, always south, toward Austin and whatever waited there. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, becoming less harsh and more settled. They saw farms in the distance, actual cultivated fields rather than just open range. They crossed roads that showed regular wagon traffic, signs of civilization multiplying with each mile. Late on the 5th day, they crested a rise and saw it in the distance. Austin, the territorial capital, sprawling along the Colorado River like a promise of order in the chaos. Church steeples rose above the other buildings. Smoke from hundreds of chimneys hazed the air. Even from miles away, Tova could see that this was different from the rough settlements scattered across the frontier. This was permanence, structure, the future that people like Daniel Bowen claimed to represent. We made it, Tess whispered, something like wonder in her voice. We made it here, Tova corrected. Now comes the hard part. Now we have to make people believe us. They descended toward the city as evening fell, 2 exhausted travelers on tired horses, carrying a story that would shake the territory's foundations if anyone was brave enough to listen. Behind them, 5 days and 100 miles of running from death. Ahead, the uncertain promise of justice. It would have to be enough. Austin was overwhelming after days in empty country. The noise hit them first, a constant hum of voices and wagons and commercial activity that never seemed to stop. Then the smells, a mixture of cooking food, horse manure, wood smoke, and humanity pressed together in ways the frontier never allowed. Tova felt exposed despite the crowds, too visible even while surrounded by hundreds of strangers. They found a livery stable on the edge of town, run by an older black man who asked no questions and charged fair prices. Tova paid for 3 days of boarding for the horses, plus extra for good grain and a thorough rub-down. The animals had earned it. The stable owner studied them with experienced eyes. These horses been pushed hard, he observed, running a hand down Tova's paint gelding's leg. Real hard. You folks running from something or towards something. Does it matter? Tova asked. Suppose it don't, the man replied. Long as you paid, which you did. Stables secure. Got a lock on the door at night. Your animals will be safe here. From the livery, they walked deeper into Austin's commercial district. Tess kept her head down and her hat low, but Tova noticed her eyes taking in everything. The brick buildings, the glass windows, the women in proper dresses walking with parasols. This was the world she'd come from originally, before the frontier had swallowed her. Now she was back, but as a fugitive rather than a citizen. The Texas Sentinel occupied a narrow two-story building, squeezed between a dry goods store and a law office. Through the front window, Tova could see a printing press and stacks of newspapers. A young man in ink-stained shirt sleeves worked at a typesetting table, his attention focused on arranging metal letters into words. "We should wait for Marcus," Tess said nervously. "He was supposed to meet us here tomorrow morning." "We don't know if Marcus made it," Tova replied. "We don't know if he was followed or caught or if Daniel got to him. We can't wait. We go in now, tell our story, and hope Crawford is the man his reputation says he is." Tess nodded slowly, gathering her courage. They entered the newspaper office, a bell above the door announcing their arrival. The young man at the typesetting table looked up, irritation crossing his face at the interruption. "We're closed for the day," he said. "New edition comes out tomorrow if you want to place an advertisement." "We need to speak with Thomas Crawford," Tova said. "It's urgent. Mr. Crawford doesn't take meetings without appointments. He'll want to hear what we have to say." Tess interrupted, stepping forward and pushing back her hat so her face was visible. "Tell him a dead woman has come back with a story about a territorial judge who tried to murder her. Tell him we have proof." The young man's eyes widened. He studied Tess's face, saw the intensity there, and apparently decided this was above his authority. "Wait here," he said, disappearing through a door at the back of the shop. They waited, in tense silence, listening to muffled voices from the back room. Tova positioned himself where he could watch both the front door and the back, his hand near his rifle. If Daniel had men in Austin, if word had somehow preceded them. The back door opened and a man emerged, followed by the young assistant. Thomas Crawford was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair and a face lined by years of skepticism. He wore a vest over a white shirt, and spectacles hung from a chain around his neck. His eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of his unexpected visitors. "I'm Crawford," he said without preamble. "My assistant says you have a remarkable story. I hear remarkable stories 3 times a week, and most of them are horseshit. Why should yours be different?" "Because I can prove mine," Tess said. She pulled out the oilcloth packet and unwrapped it, revealing the letter. This was written by Judge Daniel Bowen of Fort Griffin. It's a plan to murder his wife and make it look like she died in a Comanche raid. "I'm that wife. I'm Teresa Bowen, and I've been hiding for 3 years because my husband tried to kill me." Crawford's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He took the letter carefully and moved to a desk where lamplight was better. He read slowly, thoroughly, his face revealing nothing. When he finished, he read it again. Finally, he looked up. "This is Daniel Bowen's handwriting. I've seen his correspondence before, legal briefs he's filed. This matches his style, his patterns." Crawford set the letter down carefully. "If this is genuine, and I emphasize if, this is the biggest story to hit the territory in a decade. A territorial judge planning murder, destroying evidence, corrupting justice. It would destroy him completely." "It's genuine," Tess said. "I found it the night before the attack. I watched my house burn with another woman's body inside. I've spent 3 years running and hiding while Daniel built his career on sympathy for losing me. 2 weeks ago, his men found me and he tried again. He left me to die in the sun, tied in a sack. If Tova hadn't found me, I'd be dead now." Crawford studied her face, then Tova's, then returned to the letter. Why come to me? Why not go to the territorial marshal or the governor? Because Daniel owns them, Tova said. Or owes them favors, or they owe him. We need someone outside that system, someone who can make this public before Daniel can suppress it. Your reputation says you're that person. My reputation, Crawford said dryly. My reputation has gotten me run out of 2 states and shot at in 3 others. But yes, I publish what needs publishing regardless of who it inconveniences. He gestured to chairs near his desk. Sit. Tell me everything from the beginning. I want details, names, dates. If I'm going to publish this, it needs to be airtight. They sat, and Tess began talking. She told the whole story, starting with her marriage to Daniel and ending with Tova finding her on the canyon rim. Crawford listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When Tess finished, he turned to Tova. You're a scout, you said. You work for the settlements. Why involve yourself in this? Because she was dying and I couldn't leave her, Tova said simply. And because when I learned what Daniel had done, I couldn't ignore it. Some things are more important than staying safe. Crawford nodded slowly. You know Daniel Bowen will come after both of you when this publishes. He'll use every resource at his disposal to discredit you, to destroy you. Are you prepared for that? We're prepared to tell the truth, Tess said. What happens after? And that we can't control. The newspaper editor stood and paced his small office, thinking. I need corroboration. The letter is damning, but a good lawyer, which Daniel certainly is, could argue it's a forgery. I need witnesses, other evidence, something that makes this story unassailable. We're supposed to meet someone tomorrow, Tova said. A freighter named Marcus Chen. He's been gathering information in Fort Griffin, talking to people who knew Daniel 3 years ago. He was also meeting with a man who worked for Garrett Sloan, the man mentioned in the letter. Ah, Sloan, Crawford repeated. I know that name. He's a contractor who handles difficult problems for people with money, never been convicted of anything, but he's been connected to at least 3 suspicious deaths. If you can link him to Daniel... The front door burst open, the bell clanging wildly. Marcus Chen stumbled in, his face bruised and his shirt torn. Blood seeped from a cut above his eye. He saw Tova and Tess, and something like relief flooded his features. Thank God, Marcus gasped. I thought I was too late. Tova was on his feet instantly, catching Marcus as he swayed. What happened? Ambush 2 miles outside Austin. 4 men, professionals. They knew I was coming, knew I had information. Marcus reached into his coat with a trembling hand and pulled out a bundle of papers. I got away, but barely. They're still looking for me. Crawford took the papers and began sorting through them. Bills of sale, letters, testimony written out in Marcus's careful handwriting, evidence connecting Daniel to Garrett Sloan, proof of payments made around the time of Tess's supposed death. Names of people who'd seen things, heard things, been paid to keep quiet. This is good, Crawford said, excitement entering his voice for the first time. This is very good. Combined with the letter and Mrs. Bowen's testimony, this builds a case that's difficult to dismiss. How long to publish? Tova asked. I can have a special edition ready by tomorrow afternoon, Crawford said. I'll work through the night if necessary. But you need to understand something. The moment this hits the streets, every powerful person in the territory will be after you. The story will spread fast, but so will the backlash. You'll need protection. We'll take our chances, Tess said. No, Crawford interrupted. You won't. I've done this before, exposed corruption and watched good people get killed because they underestimated the response. You'll stay here tonight, in the rooms above the office. I'll have men I trust watching the building. Tomorrow, when the edition publishes, you'll go directly to the U.S. Marshal's office. Not the territorial marshal, the federal one. His name is Harrison Kent, and he's clean. I've worked with him before. It was a better plan than anything they'd come up with. Tova looked at Tess, who nodded agreement. Marcus had collapsed into a chair, exhausted from his flight and his injuries. The young assistant had disappeared into the back room and now returned with water and bandages. I'll tend to your friend, the assistant said, kneeling beside Marcus. Mr. Crawford, you want me to start setting type? Yes. Front page headline, full story below. Use the largest type we have. Crawford turned back to Tova and Tess. This is going to shake the territory to its foundations. People are going to be forced to choose sides. Some will stand with you, but many will stand with Daniel. Power protects power. You need to be ready for that. We're ready, Tova said, though he wondered if that was true. They spent the next hour giving Crawford every detail they could remember while he took notes and asked penetrating questions. The young assistant worked at the typesetting table, metal letters clicking into place with mechanical precision. Marcus was bandaged and given whiskey, his injuries painful but not serious. As midnight approached, the shape of the story was complete. Crawford read his notes back to them, making sure every fact was accurate. The story was devastating in its simplicity. A territorial judge, motivated by ambition and a new romantic interest, had planned and executed the murder of his wife. He'd used his position and connections to cover up the crime, had profited from sympathy, and had recently attempted to complete what he'd started when his wife unexpectedly resurfaced. The evidence was laid out clearly, the letter reproduced in full, the witness testimony detailed and specific. It's perfect, Tess said quietly. It's everything I've wanted to say for 3 years. Then we publish, Crawford said. Come morning, the territory will know the truth. What happens after that is up to the people and the law. They were shown to rooms above the newspaper office, simple but clean. Tova took the first watch, sitting by the window and watching the street below. Austin was quieter at night but never truly silent. People moved in the darkness, going about business that didn't welcome daylight. Somewhere out there, Daniel's men might be searching, or they might already know where their quarry had gone to ground. Tess appeared beside him, unable to sleep. Do you think it will work? She asked. Do you think people will believe the truth? I think some will, Tova said. Others won't want to believe it because it's inconvenient or because they've invested too much in Daniel's version of events. But once the truth is out there, it takes on a life of its own. It can't be completely suppressed. I'm scared, Tess admitted. I've been scared for 3 years, but this is different. Tomorrow, everything changes. We either win or we die. There's no middle ground anymore. There never was, Tova said gently. We were always going to reach this point. At least now we're facing it on our terms, rather than Daniel's. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Crawford and his assistant working below. The printing press began to operate, its mechanical rhythm steady and relentless. Each revolution of that press was another copy of the truth being created, another piece of evidence that couldn't be destroyed. Dawn came grey and uncertain, clouds obscuring the sun. Tova had dozed fitfully, waking at every sound from the street. Marcus emerged from his room looking better. The color returned to his face. Tess was pale but composed, dressed in clean clothes that Crawford's assistant had somehow procured during the night. Crawford met them in his office, his eyes red from lack of sleep but burning with satisfaction. It's done, he said, gesturing to stacks of newspapers fresh from the press. 500 copies. I'm sending them to every settlement in the territory, every territorial office, every place where people gather and talk. By tomorrow, everyone in Texas will know what Daniel Bowen did. Tova picked up one of the newspapers. The headline was stark and simple. Territorial judge accused of murder. Wife he claimed dead reveals 3-year deception. Below, the story unfolded in careful detail, every fact checked, every source named. It was devastating and undeniable. The federal marshal's office opens at 8, Crawford said. I'll take you there myself. But first, you should know that I sent advance copies to the territorial governor and several other officials last night. I wanted them to see this coming. Some of them will try to contain it, but others will recognize they need to distance themselves from Daniel immediately. How will Daniel react? Marcus asked. Badly, Crawford said flatly. He'll deny everything, call it lies and forgery. He'll pressure his allies to suppress the story. He'll probably try to have me arrested on some pretext. And he'll absolutely try to silence the 3 of you permanently. That's why you need federal protection immediately. A knock at the door interrupted them. Crawford's assistant opened it carefully, then stepped back to admit a man in a dark suit and marshal's badge. He was perhaps 40, with steady eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen violence and learned to control it rather than fear it. "Marshal Kent," Crawford said with visible relief. "You got my message." "Got your advance copy too," Kent replied. His eyes moved to Tess, Tova, and Marcus, assessing them. "Hell of a story if it's true." "It's true," Tess said, meeting his gaze directly. "Every word." Kent studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you. I've had my doubts about Bowen for a while now. Nothing I could prove, just instinct telling me something was wrong. This explains a lot." He turned to Crawford. "When does this hit the streets?" "My people are distributing it now," Crawford said. "It'll be everywhere by noon." "Then we need to move fast," Kent said. "Judge Bowen will have heard about this by now. He'll be planning his response. Mrs. Bowen, you and your companions are now under federal protection. Anyone who tries to harm you will answer to me and to the full authority of the United States government." The words carried weight that territorial authority never could. Federal law superseded local power, could override even a territorial judge's influence. For the first time since finding Tess on that canyon rim, Tova felt like they might actually survive this. "There's something you should know," Marcus said. "Daniel has men in Austin. The ones who ambushed me yesterday are still here. They'll be watching for us. Then we'll be watching for them," Kent replied. "I've got deputies who can handle hired guns. Let them try something. I'd welcome the excuse to arrest them." They left the newspaper office together, Kent and 2 deputies forming a protective cordon around them. The streets were filling with people as morning business began. Tova saw several men reading the Sentinel's special edition, their faces showing shock and disbelief. The truth was spreading, just as Crawford had promised. The federal marshal's office was a solid brick building with barred windows and heavy doors. Inside, Kent directed them to a secure room while he organized a formal investigation. "This is going to take time," he warned. "We'll need to interview witnesses, verify evidence, build a case that will stand up in federal court. Daniel Bowen has rights, even accused of murder. We have to do this by the book." "How long?" Tess asked. "Days, maybe weeks. But you'll be safe here. No one gets to you while you're under my protection." Through the office windows, Tova could see the city reacting to the news. People gathered in groups, newspapers in hand, arguing and gesturing. Some faces showed anger, others satisfaction. The story was doing exactly what Crawford had predicted, forcing people to choose sides. By afternoon, the full weight of the revelation had hit. The territorial governor issued a statement calling for a thorough investigation. Other territorial judges distanced themselves from Daniel. Business leaders who'd supported him suddenly discovered pressing reasons to reconsider their associations. The machinery of power was turning against the man who'd thought himself untouchable, but Daniel Bowen wasn't finished. Word came that he'd barricaded himself in his Fort Griffin office, surrounded by loyal men, refusing to surrender to territorial authorities. He'd issued his own statement calling the accusations lies, demanding the arrest of Crawford, Tess, and Tova for criminal conspiracy. He was fighting back with everything he had. "Let him fight," Kent said when he heard. "Every move he makes now just makes him look more guilty. Innocent men don't surround themselves with gunmen and refuse to cooperate with investigations." As evening fell on that first day, Tova stood at the window of the secure room and watched Austin's lights come on, one by one. Somewhere out there, Daniel Bowen was planning his next move. Somewhere, men loyal to him were preparing violence. But here, in this room, the truth had been told and could not be untold. Tess came to stand beside him. "It's really happening," she said wonderingly. "People are listening. They're believing, some of them," Tova cautioned. "Others will never believe, no matter what evidence they see. But enough believe. That's what matters. What happens now?" "Now we wait," Tova said. "We let the law work. We trust that justice will prevail." And we prepare for whatever Daniel tries next, because he's not going to surrender quietly. Outside, in the gathering darkness, the territory held its breath. The story was out, the truth was spreading, and nothing would ever be the same. The siege lasted 3 days. Daniel Bowen, barricaded in his Fort Griffin office with 6 armed men, refused every attempt at negotiation. Federal marshals surrounded the building, while curious townspeople gathered at a safe distance, watching their territorial judge transform from respected authority to desperate criminal. The newspapers printed special editions daily, each one adding new details to the story that had captivated the entire territory. In Austin, Tess gave her formal testimony to Marshal Kent and a federal prosecutor who'd arrived from Dallas. She spent hours recounting every detail, answering questions that probed every corner of her story. The prosecutor was thorough and skeptical, which Tess said was actually reassuring. If he was convinced despite his skepticism, a jury would be too. "Your testimony is compelling," the prosecutor told her on the second day. Combined with the letter, the financial records Mr. Chen obtained, and the witnesses who've started coming forward, we have a strong case. "Very strong witnesses?" Tess asked with surprise. "7 so far," the prosecutor said. "People from Fort Griffin who saw things 3 years ago but were too afraid to speak. A ranch hand who saw Daniel meeting with Garrett Sloan in secret. A clerk who processed unusual payments from Daniel's accounts. A woman who heard Daniel and Lydia Morland discussing marriage plans weeks before your supposed death. Fear kept them silent before. Your courage has given them courage." The words settled over Tess like a weight and a relief combined. She wasn't alone anymore. Others had seen pieces of the truth and were finally willing to speak it. The conspiracy of silence that had protected Daniel was crumbling. On the 3rd day of the siege, word came that Garrett Sloan had been arrested in San Antonio, attempting to board a ship for Mexico. Federal marshals had found evidence in his possession linking him directly to Daniel, including payment records and correspondence that corroborated everything in the original letter. Sloan was offering to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. "It's over," Marcus said that evening as they gathered in Marshal Kent's office. "Daniel has to know he can't win now. Too many witnesses, too much evidence. Even his allies have abandoned him." But Daniel Bowen wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily. On the morning of the 4th day, gunfire erupted in Fort Griffin. The siege ended in violence as Daniel's men attempted to fight their way out of the surrounded building. Federal marshals returned fire, and when the smoke cleared, 3 of Daniel's men were dead and 2 were wounded. Daniel himself had been shot in the shoulder while trying to escape through a back window. The news reached Austin by telegraph within an hour. Daniel Bowen was in custody, wounded but alive, charged with murder, conspiracy, and a list of other crimes that would ensure he never held authority again. His political career was destroyed. His reputation was ash. The man who'd tried to kill his wife to advance his ambitions had lost everything instead. Tess received the news in silence, her face unreadable. Tova watched her carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. He'd expected relief, maybe even joy. What he saw instead was something more complex, a mixture of emotions too tangled to separate. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Tess admitted. "I spent 3 years wanting this, imagining it, dreaming about the day Daniel would face justice. Now that it's here, I just feel empty. Like I've been carrying something so heavy for so long that now that it's gone, I don't know what to do with the space it left behind." "You fill it with living," Marcus suggested. "Real living, not just surviving. You build the life he tried to take from you." Over the following weeks, the legal machinery ground forward with inexorable momentum. Daniel was transported to Austin under heavy guard and held in the federal jail to await trial. His lawyer, one of the best in the territory, argued for bail and was denied. The evidence against Daniel was overwhelming, the public sentiment hostile. No judge wanted to be seen as showing favoritism to a man accused of such calculated evil. Lydia Morland was also arrested, charged as an accomplice, after evidence emerged that she'd known about Daniel's plan and had helped him establish his alibi. Her connection to the territorial governor became a scandal in itself, forcing investigations into who else might have been complicit. The corruption that had protected Daniel began to unravel, exposing networks of favors and compromises that had allowed powerful men to operate above the law. The trial was set for October, 2 months away. The prosecutor assured Tess that conviction was almost certain, but she'd need to testify again, this time in open court with Daniel present. The thought terrified her, but she agreed without hesitation. This was what she'd fought for, what she'd risked everything to achieve. In the meantime, life took on a strange new rhythm. Tess stayed in Austin, living in a boarding house under federal protection. She was no longer hiding, but she wasn't entirely free either, still constrained by security concerns and the weight of her notoriety. Everyone in Austin knew her face now, knew her story. Some people treated her with sympathy and respect. Others looked at her with suspicion or resentment, upset that she'd disrupted their comfortable assumptions. Tova remained in Austin as well, officially employed by Marshal Kent to provide security and to serve as a witness when the trial came. The work was easier than frontier scouting, but somehow less satisfying. He missed the open country, the solitude, the simple clarity of reading tracks and weather rather than navigating human complications. Marcus had returned to his freight business, though he made frequent trips to Austin to check on Tess and Tova. The notoriety had actually helped his business, as people wanted to hire the freighter who'd helped expose corruption. He accepted the attention with good humor and quiet satisfaction. 6 weeks after Daniel's arrest, Tess and Tova sat together on a bench outside the federal building, watching the evening activity on Austin streets. They'd fallen into the habit of these quiet conversations, finding comfort in each other's company after everything they'd been through together. "What will you do?" Tess asked. "After the trial? Will you go back to scouting?" Tova had been thinking about that question. Maybe, or maybe it's time for something different. The frontier is changing. In 10 years, 20 years, there won't be much need for scouts. The whole territory will be settled, civilized, tamed. Men like me won't fit anymore. Men like you will always fit somewhere, Tess said. You're the kind of person who sees what needs doing and does it, regardless of convenience or danger. The world always needs people like that. What about you? Tova asked. Have you thought about what comes after? I've thought about it constantly, Tess admitted. For 3 years, I've been focused on survival, and then on exposing Daniel. I never let myself think beyond that, because I didn't know if there would be a beyond. Now there is, and I have no idea what to do with it. You could teach again, Tova suggested. That's what you came west to do originally. Maybe, Tess said doubtfully. But I'm not the same person who came west to teach school. That woman was naive, sheltered, full of idealistic notions about civilizing the frontier. The woman I am now understands that civilization can be just as brutal as wilderness, just in different ways. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Austin. The city was growing, changing, building itself into something permanent. In a few years, this place would be unrecognizable. But the people, the fundamental nature of human beings, that would remain constant. Capacity for both good and evil, courage and cowardice, justice and corruption. The trial began on a crisp October morning, with the courthouse packed beyond capacity. People who couldn't fit inside crowded the steps and the street, waiting for news. Reporters from newspapers across the territory and beyond filled the press section. This was more than just a trial. It was a referendum on whether justice could actually prevail against power and influence. Tess sat in the front row, flanked by Marshal Kent and one of his deputies. Tova sat directly behind her, close enough to provide support if she needed it. Marcus was somewhere in the crowded courtroom, Having arrived that morning from Fort Griffin, with news of how Daniel's former constituents were reacting, Daniel was brought in wearing shackles, his wounded shoulder still stiff, his face haggard from weeks of incarceration. He'd lost weight, and the confident bearing that had once defined him was gone. But his eyes still held intelligence and calculation. He wasn't broken, just cornered, and cornered animals were dangerous. The trial lasted 8 days. The prosecution presented their case with methodical precision. The letter was authenticated by handwriting experts. Financial records showed payments to Garrett Sloan, corresponding to the dates mentioned in Tess's testimony. Witnesses described Daniel's relationship with Lydia Moreland, his growing desperation to escape his marriage, his meetings with men of questionable reputation. Garrett Sloan testified on the 4th day, his voice flat and unemotional as he described how Daniel had hired him to arrange a death that looked like a Comanche raid. Sloan had purchased a female captive from actual Comancheros, had killed her and placed her body in the Bowen ranch house, had set the fire himself, while Daniel was establishing his alibi in Austin. The courtroom sat in horrified silence as Sloan laid out the mechanics of murder with the detachment of a man describing routine business. Daniel's lawyer tried to discredit the witnesses, arguing that Sloan was lying to reduce his own sentence, that the letter could have been forged. The Tess might be an imposter motivated by money or revenge. But each argument fell flat against the weight of evidence. Too many pieces fit together too perfectly. The story held together because it was true. On the 6th day, Tess took the stand. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing she'd have to recount her trauma in front of hundreds of strangers, while Daniel watched and listened. But when the moment came, she found strength she didn't know she possessed. Her voice was steady as she described her marriage, her discovery of the letter, her flight from the burning ranch house. She met Daniel's eyes directly as she testified about being grabbed by his men 2 months ago, about the burlap sack, about lying on the canyon rim waiting to die. "Mrs. Bowen," the prosecutor asked, "why did you wait 3 years to come forward? Why not go to the authorities immediately?" "Because my husband was the authority," Tess replied, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "He was a judge, connected to every powerful person in the territory. Who would have believed a woman with no proof over a man with his reputation and influence? I ran because it was the only way to stay alive." Daniel's lawyer cross-examined her aggressively, trying to find inconsistencies in her story, suggesting she'd abandoned her marriage for other reasons and invented the murder plot later. But Tess held firm, her answers consistent with everything she'd said before. The lawyer's aggression actually worked against him, making Daniel look cruel for attacking a woman he'd already tried to kill. Dover testified on the 7th day, describing how he'd found Tess and what he'd learned subsequently. His reputation as an honest scout carried weight with the jury. When Daniel's lawyer tried to suggest Dover had been paid to support a false narrative, Marshal Kent intervened with testimony about Dover's character and his cooperation with federal authorities. The final day brought closing arguments. The prosecutor's case was devastating in its simplicity. Daniel Bowen had wanted to advance his career and marry a woman with better connections. His wife was an obstacle, so he'd arranged her death and profited from the sympathy it generated. When she'd unexpectedly resurfaced, he'd tried again. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict should be swift and certain. Daniel's lawyer made the best argument he could with the materials at hand. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of the possibility that others had framed Daniel, of the need to be absolutely certain before destroying a man's life. But even he seemed to know it was futile. The evidence was simply too strong. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, their faces told the story before the foreman spoke. Guilty on all charges: murder, conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. The courtroom erupted in reactions ranging from satisfaction to dismay. Tess sat very still, tears running silently down her face. Daniel's face showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his hands gripped the table in front of him until his knuckles went white. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood slowly. "I regret," Daniel said, his voice hollow, "that I underestimated my wife. I thought she was weak, someone who could be controlled or eliminated. I was wrong. She was stronger than I ever imagined, and that strength has destroyed me. I don't ask for mercy because I showed none. I only ask that history remember I tried to build something here, tried to bring law and order to a lawless place. Even if I myself became lawless in the pursuit, it was as close to a confession as he would ever give." The judge, a federal appointee with no connection to territorial politics, showed no sympathy. He sentenced Daniel to hang, the sentence to be carried out in 30 days. The courtroom erupted again, and Daniel was led away in shackles, his face finally showing the defeat he'd been fighting. Outside the courthouse, Tess stood on the steps, surrounded by a crowd of well-wishers and reporters. Questions flew at her from every direction, but Marshal Kent kept them at bay. Tova stayed close, ready to intervene if the crowd became threatening. But most faces showed support, even admiration. Thomas Crawford pushed through the crowd and shook Tess's hand. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "You've shown that truth can still prevail, even against power. That's a lesson this territory needed. I just wanted justice," Tess said quietly. "I wanted people to know what really happened." "You got both," Crawford replied. "And you've made it easier for the next person who faces what you faced. You've proven it's possible to fight back and win." The weeks between verdict and execution passed in a strange, suspended state. Tess remained in Austin, suddenly famous and uncertain what to do with her newfound freedom. Job offers arrived, from schools wanting to hire her as a teacher, from lecture bureaus wanting her to speak about her experiences. She considered them all with careful thought. Tova prepared to return to the frontier, feeling the pull of open country and simple work. But he found himself reluctant to leave, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. Marcus, visiting from Fort Griffin, called him on it one evening over whiskey. "You're in love with her," Marcus said bluntly. "Anyone with eyes can see it. The question is what you're going to do about it." "She's my brother's widow," Tova started. "She's a woman who's been through hell and come out the other side," Marcus interrupted. "A woman who deserves happiness if she can find it. You think Daniel would care about propriety? You think he has any claim on her anymore?" Tova had no answer for that. The truth was, he did care for Tess, had grown to admire her courage and respect her strength. But the complications seemed insurmountable. They came from different worlds, had different expectations for life. And yet, 3 days before Daniel's scheduled execution, Tess invited Tova to walk with her along the Colorado River. They found a quiet spot, away from the city's bustle, and sat on the bank, watching water flow past. "I've decided what I'm going to do," Tess said. "I'm going to stay in Texas, but not in Austin. I'm going to Fort Griffin. I'm going to teach there, in the town that believed Daniel's lies about me. I'm going to look those people in the eye every day and show them I'm not ashamed, that I survived, that I won." "That's brave," Tova said. "Maybe too brave." "Maybe," Tess agreed. "But I've been running for 3 years. I'm done running. Fort Griffin was my home once, or it tried to be. I'm going to make it my home for real this time." She turned to look at him directly. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. These past months, everything we've been through together, was it just circumstances? Or was it something more?" Tova met her gaze, seeing the vulnerability beneath her strength. "It was something more," he admitted. "At least for me. But Tess, I'm not the kind of man you should build a life with. I'm not educated or refined. I don't fit in civilized society." "Neither do I," Tess said. "Not anymore. Maybe not ever. I'm not looking for refined, Tova. I'm looking for real. I'm looking for someone who sees me as I actually am, not as society says I should be. These past months, you've seen me at my worst and never flinched. You've risked everything to help me when you had no obligation to. That's worth more than all the refinement in the world." They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of what was being offered and accepted settling between them. Finally, Tova spoke. "If we do this, it won't be easy. Fort Griffin will have opinions People will talk, let them talk, Tess said. I've been dead for 3 years. I get to decide how to live now. On the morning of Daniel's execution, neither Tess nor Tova attended. They'd seen enough of Daniel Bowen, lived too long under the shadow of his crimes. Instead, they stood together at the Austin train depot, preparing to travel to Fort Griffin and begin whatever came next. Marcus met them there with supplies and well wishes. I'll be through Fort Griffin regularly on my freight routes, he said. I expect to see you both thriving, not just surviving. We'll do our best, Tess promised. The train pulled into the station, steam hissing and wheels screeching. Passengers boarded for destinations across the territory. Tess and Tova picked up their bags and joined the flow of humanity moving forward into an uncertain future. As the train pulled out of Austin, Tess looked back at the city where she'd finally found justice. Then she turned to face forward toward Fort Griffin and whatever awaited there. Tova sat beside her, solid and steady, no longer just her protector but her partner in whatever came next. The frontier was changing, becoming more settled, more civilized. But the fundamental truths remained constant. Courage mattered. Justice was possible. Truth could prevail against lies. And sometimes, out of tragedy and trauma, new life could grow. Through the train window, the Texas landscape rolled past, endless and full of possibility. Somewhere out there, under that vast sky, was a future worth building. Together they would build it one day at a time, one choice at a time. The train carried them forward into that future, leaving the past behind at last. The burlap sack on the canyon rim was just a memory now. What mattered was the road ahead, and they would travel it together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.